Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. I'm speaking with Sue Holt, genealogist who researched her family's ancestry in Kenosha County dating to the 1840s. Welcome. Thanks for talking with me.
Happy to be here.
So can you tell me about those first relatives who came into Kenosha County?
The first relatives who came from the Isle of Man, a small island between Ireland and England. They came in the 1840s and applied for a land grant and got 120 acres in Twin Lakes. Ultimately, they bought more acreage, but they started out with 120 acres.
Okay. Was Twin Lakes the area they settled in?
Yes, Twin Lakes, Wisconsin, and it was my great-grandparents.
Okay. And did they settle in Twin Lakes because that was where the journey was going to end, or did they plan on going further west?
They planned on going to Lake Geneva, but my great-grandmother said, "This is it. I can't go any farther. Wherever we are, we're going to stay."
Okay. So on this 120 acres, what did they do?
My great-grandfather was a mason.
Okay.
And he built a lot of the walls around the area in Twin Lakes and Munster and those areas. But the one thing he did was build a big wall around his own property and another wall that kept the cattle in. I believe there were so many rocks out there. They had to do something. And being a mason, that was the logical move for him.
Okay. So did he actually cement them together or just
Yes,
stack them?
he cemented them together. And part of the wall is still in existence.
Okay. And he came from the Isle of Man, and in the home that he had there, was he also building masonry things?
Yes, I had the opportunity to visit the Isle of Man and to go to the area and see the home that they lived in, the home that they left in the 1840s. And there was the very same wall all around that house as well.
Okay. How about your mother's side?
My mother's family came from Ireland.
When was that?
Some of them came in the 1850s, early 1850s. That was the Cantwells. And the English, the family name was English, but they claimed they were Irish. And they came shortly after that. And the house they lived in is still standing on the corner of 60th Street and 3rd Avenue. They had 14 children of their own and raised 3 more. So they raised 17 children in that house.
Wow. So on your mother's side, what was her name?
Cantwell.
The first name?
Elizabeth.
Okay.
Elizabeth Cantwell.
Okay. Now, one of your relatives came from Ireland alone.
Yes.
And who was that?
That was Mary Cantwell. She was about 38 years old, and she came with 4 children, the oldest of whom was probably about 10 years old, and she left her husband in Ireland.
And the purpose of her leaving her husband and coming to America, why was that?
She never explained that.
Okay.
She just said he didn't want to come. I wanted to come. I knew it would be better for the children. So while he was away on a trip to England, she packed up the children and came to America.
And was this the place she intended to come, or did she have a stop off beforehand?
I believe she came directly to Kenosha, which leads me to believe she had to have somebody here. Her maiden name was Grogan. It was a very prominent Irish name in Kenosha in the 1840s and 50s. And I have researched those Grogans as well to try to find the connection. I believe she had a brother here. The people in Europe that came the way she did had to have somebody here.
In order to get into the country.
Well, in order to have a livelihood, they had to have somebody's home to go to, somebody who would take care of them till they were in a position to take care of themselves.
Okay, so going back to the Grogans, who were out in the western part of Kenosha County.
Well, there were Grogans living on 59th Street and about 4th Avenue in Kenosha. Some of the later descendants moved out to the western part of the county and even into Illinois.
Okay, and one of the ancestors who came out to the western part of the county but played an instrument, right?
I believe the reason that was daughter, and I believe the reason she went out there is she married a man from out there, and it was curious to me because I wondered how she would ever meet anybody out there, but I believe it was through the church.
Okay. And you mentioned previously, before this interview, that you had an ancestor who played a violin.
That was the gentleman in Twin Lakes, the Quail, who played the violin. There were Indians in Twin Lakes at the time living up on Mount Moriah. And the Indians would travel and go to a different place part of the year. And they would march through the Quail property. And when my ancestor saw them coming, he would get his violin out and play. And the Indians were just so interested in what that was that made that beautiful music.
Okay, so you mentioned the Quail family, which is the ancestors who came from the Isle of Man.
Yes.
Okay, who was that?
His name was Daniel Quail. He was born in 1797 in the Isle of Man. His wife was Margaret Milcrane, who was born in 1811 on the Isle of Man. And they had 4 daughters when they came here.
Okay, and how did they spell the name? Did the name change at all over time?
The name in the Isle of Man was Quayle. When they got here, everything turned out to be Quail, which is the common spelling for the bird. And it was that way in the census records, which made it difficult to find them right away. But I did search and found them, and when the children, the 4 little girls that they had, went to school, and as they got in school a few years, the name reverted back to the proper spelling, and I believe that's because they found out how to spell it correctly.
Okay, tell me about some of your other, your great-great-grandfather or another great-grandfather, about what they did when they were in Kenosha County. You had one who was in the military.
Pardon?
You had one in the military?
Yes. the Ackermans, who married into the Quayle family, were from New York, and one of the gentlemen was active in the military and in the War of 1812 and received bounty land in Twin Lakes. When he came to Twin Lakes in about the 1860s or 70s, they had money and built a hotel called the Ackerman Hotel in Twin Lakes. And that burned down in my lifetime. I was able to see that. And in the 1920s and 30s, it was very common for young couples in Kenosha to go out to Twin Lakes. There was a train that went out to Twin Lakes and stopped at that hotel, and that was sort of quite a getaway for the younger people in Kenosha.
Okay, so when this ancestor was discharged from service and was given bounty land, did he have any trouble applying for it?
He didn't have trouble applying for it. My other great-grandfather on the Cantwell side, name was Tafe, James Tafe, Taaffe, very Irish name. He was in the War of 1812, but when he went to apply for the bounty land, he found he didn't have the proper papers. He lost his discharge papers. So in order to prove that he was eligible for that land, he had to get prominent people in Kenosha to sign saying, yes, he was the same James Tafe that fought in the War of 1812. I was able to obtain all those records in Washington, and it was very interesting to see some of the prominent names.
Okay, did you have an ancestor who moved further west, or did they all stay around the Twin Lakes area?
They stayed around Kenosha. My great-grandfather, whose name was Isaac Clapp, went out to the gold rush in the 1850s, but then he came back to Kenosha and lived here.
Okay, and your father and mother, what did they do? You were born in Kenosha.
Yes.
They worked. Your father worked, and what did he do?
My father went to college at the University of New Mexico and came back after graduation and worked at the American Brass in the laboratory. He was a chemist.
Okay.
My mother, as most women at that time, she was not employed outside the home.
But she worked.
She worked.
Yes, of course. Okay, and being born here, where did you grow up?
I grew up on 37th Avenue and 61st Street in Kenosha.
And your elementary school was which?
McKinley.
And what was it like going to elementary school at McKinley?
It was a long walk.
And where
Nobody got a ride. I lived on 61st and 37th, and the school was on about 33rd, maybe 57th. So it was a long walk, but nobody thought anything about that. We all walked to school together. Some of the teachers even lived in the area where I did, and the teachers would walk to school.
Okay, did you have any siblings?
Pardon?
Did you have any siblings, brothers and
Yes,
sisters? And
I had a brother and a sister.
so
Yes.
they would walk to school with you? Were you
Yes,
close? Okay.
yes.
And what was it like going to school at that time?
It was great. We all enjoyed school. I went to the portables at McKinley School, which was one building for each grade. And somebody got there early in the morning and started the fire in the big furnace, and it was always cozy and warm, and we started every day with the Pledge of Allegiance. It was good schooling.
Okay, and you would not take a lunch to school at that time. You would walk home for lunch?
Yes, we walked 4 times a day.
How about if it rained?
We walked in the rain.
Okay, so let's go on further in your life. When you graduated from high school, what did you do after that?
I was married and I have 4 daughters. When the youngest daughter was in first grade, I started college.
Okay.
Took 1 course at a time, worked in some of the libraries in Kenosha, and I went to Carthage College after a 2-year degree at Gateway. I went to Carthage College, and I graduated from there in 1984.
And what degree did you obtain? What degree did you have?
I have a degree in history and religion.
Okay. And what turned you toward an interest in genealogy?
What interested me to start with was my last name, Quayle. Nobody ever knew that name. The teachers could not pronounce it. And my father was so proud of his name, and he would say, "You tell him your name is Quayle and you're Manx. You're from the Isle of Man. That's where your ancestors were from." A teacher would ask us all what nationality we were, and I would proudly say, "I'm Manx," and she'd say, "I'm not sure I know what that is." So then I would point it out to her on the map, and she'd say, "Well, then you're probably just English." So when I went home and told my father that, he got very angry and said, "You tell her that's not right. You're Manx. We have our own country, our own stamps, our own money. We are Manx people."
All right, and then what did you do either while you were going to school or after school? Did you work with anybody? Anybody that you remember working with at one time?
Yes, at Carthage College, I worked for Mr. Bishop and I worked for Betty Kendall. And I started doing genealogy maybe 20 years before that.
Okay.
So while I was working at Carthage, I was able to teach a genealogy class at Parkside and at Gateway.
Okay. Were you involved in Kenosha history in any other way?
Yes, I worked at the Kenosha County History Center. When it was on 3rd Avenue, it was a home. I believe the address was probably about 6308, something like that. And prior to that, the Historical Society was just in the basement of the courthouse where Carrie Cropley worked. She wrote a book about the history of Kenosha. She devoted her life to Kenosha County history.
Could you tell me a little bit about her? What was she like?
She was a wonderful historian. Her father was a historian, and that's where she started becoming interested in Kenosha history. And she wrote a very good history of the area.
Okay. And when did you begin researching your family?
I started researching in 1963. And the reason I started was in the Kenosha County History Center. They had this 1850 census, and there was Daniel Quayle and Margaret Quayle and their daughters and a couple of sons at that time. And that was the first time I had ever seen the name Quayle anyplace else. So I asked my father, who do you think these people are? He said, well, they were my grandparents. And so that started me. I said, well, what do you know about them? He said, very little, except they lived in Twin Lakes. And so I encouraged myself to get going on the research and found out after they got here they had more children. They wound up, they had 11 children born out in Twin Lakes, many of whom died very young. But some did live to grow up and get married and have children. And when I found the wills of Daniel and Margaret Quayle, I found that they left grandchildren different things, maybe $5, maybe a frying pan, maybe a horse.
And have you finished researching your family?
One never finishes that. You're never done.
Okay, and after teaching genealogy, which you've taught for how many years?
47.
All in Kenosha?
No, some in Sarasota, Florida, where I spent the winter. I taught the class at the University of South Florida.
Okay, and did you have a lot of students?
A lot of students from all over the country, because many were retired down in Sarasota. When I taught the class at Kenosha, I would start out with about 12 to 15 students, and I would say to them, before the 6 weeks class is over, at least 2 of you are going to find you're related to each other, which always happened because the families had been here for so long. In Florida, of course, that wasn't the case.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and when a student finished with your class, did you have any advice for them? Did you help them
Yes.
further?
I would always tell them they had help from me for the rest of my life. I had a card with my phone number on, and I said, you call me anytime and I'll help you. And I did that many times. Helped a lot of people who were adopted find their biological parents, which was a very rewarding experience.
Do you have any stories, or now let's call them stories, about students and what they learned in your class?
Yes, I had some students from Germany whose parents and grandparents were killed during World War II. That was always interesting to try to research that because so many of the records were lost. Mm-hmm. And in helping the people who were adopted, it was so rewarding to me to be able to show them, this was your mother, this was your father.
Okay, and today, where is your research taking you? Where is it taking you today? I mean, you've gone all the way back to the 1840s. What branches of the family are you still searching?
I still work on the Cantwells and the Quayles from this area. I suppose because it's easier for me to work from here because the records are all here. And when I go over to Greenridge Cemetery and take my grandchildren, I can say, this lady is your grandmother's grandmother's grandmother. Don't forget it.
Okay, and what about the state of genealogy today?
I'm sorry to say it has changed so drastically, and not always in a good way, because people tend to get on the computer, look up their last name, and if their last name is an unusual name, they sort of latch on to anybody else that has that name, and that is not the way you do research. You go to the courthouse. and you look up a birth record. You get parents' names. You look up their names. You go to the census records and look through them. And also wills are so important, because a will, whether the people died with a will or intestate without a will, there's always records, because people come forth that say that deceased person owed them money, and they owed them money for this or for that, and this is where you get more clues. And so that's really the kind of research I approve of, not just going on the internet and finding somebody with the same last name. Now, the DNA has been a good addition to genealogy.
How is that?
I will get notices through Ancestry that say, I know you're not my mother, I know you're not my sibling, but we're closely related and I've adopted. Can you help me? And that's where it starts.
Well, thank you for talking with me today.
My pleasure.